They said a husband should be a shelter in life's storms. But after all these years, I found I was just the storm's debris, discarded, unloved, unwanted. One chilly New York morning, I stood outside on the fire escape of our cramped apartment, the scent of last night's rain mingling with the faint whistle of distant traffic, clutching a single faded photo of us from happier times. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Maria, and for 37 years, I believed in promises, especially his promises. When I met Roberto in 1987 at a community center dance in the Bronx, he had this way of making everything sound possible. The overhead fluorescent lights cast shadows across his confident smile as he whispered about the life we'd build together. "Maria," he'd say, his hands warm against mine, "I'm going to give you everything you deserve. We're going to leave this place behind and make something beautiful." I was 25 then, working double shifts at a textile factory on the Lower East Side, my fingers raw from the machines, my dreams bigger than the paycheck that barely covered rent for the studio apartment I shared with 2 roommates. The walls were so thin you could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door arguing with her television every night, and the radiator clanged like a broken symphony that never let you sleep properly. But Roberto painted pictures with his words. He talked about the apartment we'd have in Manhattan, with windows that actually opened and stayed open, where you could hear jazz floating up from the street instead of sirens and shouting. He described lazy Sunday mornings with real coffee, not the instant powder I stirred into lukewarm tap water, and evenings when we'd dress up just because we could afford nice clothes. Those early years, I lived on those promises like they were oxygen. Every morning, I'd wake up in our tiny one-bedroom in the Bronx. We'd managed to scrape together enough for our own place 6 months after the wedding, and I'd look at his sleeping face and think, today might be the day everything changes. I'd make breakfast from whatever was left in the refrigerator, usually eggs and day-old bread, and I'd hum while I cooked because I truly believed we were building towards something magnificent. The apartment smelled like old cigarettes from the previous tenant and the damp that seeped through the walls every winter, but I tried to make it beautiful. I sewed curtains from fabric remnants I brought home from the factory, and I arranged our few wedding gifts: a toaster that only worked on one side, a set of mismatched plates from his aunt, 2 glasses with tiny chips around the rim, like they were treasures in a palace. Roberto was always working on something. His desk, which was really just a folding table we'd bought at a garage sale, was covered with legal pads filled with his handwriting, business plans, sketches of inventions, phone numbers scribbled on napkins. He'd stay up until 3 in the morning, the blue light from his old computer casting strange shadows across his face, typing and deleting and typing again. "What are you working on tonight?" I'd ask, bringing him coffee in our only uncracked mug. "Something big, mi amor," he'd always say, never really explaining. "Something that's going to change everything for us." I learned not to ask too many questions. When I did, he'd get that distant look, like I was interrupting something important, something I couldn't possibly understand. "You have to trust me, Maria," he'd say, his voice gentle but firm. I know what I'm doing, and I did trust him, completely. When the bills piled up and he asked me to pick up weekend shifts at the factory, I said yes without hesitation. When he needed money to buy equipment for his latest project, I borrowed from my sister Carmen, promising her we'd pay it back within a month. When the phone calls started coming from creditors, I took extra babysitting jobs in the evenings, watching the Martinez kids next door while their parents worked their own double shifts. "We're in this together," I remember telling him one freezing January morning, pressing cold coffee into his trembling hands. The heat had been shut off for 3 days, and we were both wearing layers of sweaters inside the apartment. "Whatever it takes, Roberto. We're building something." He smiled then, but it was different from those early smiles at the community center. This one had edges to it, sharp corners I pretended not to see. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Maria," he said, but his eyes were already drifting back to his computer screen. The sacrifices felt natural then. When I got sick with bronchitis that winter and missed a week of work, I didn't go to the doctor because we couldn't afford the copay. When my friend Isabel invited me to her daughter's quinceañera, I declined because I'd already spent my last $20 on groceries. When Roberto's projects required him to network, to take potential investors out for dinners I never attended, I convinced myself it was temporary. Business is different now, he'd explain when I asked why I couldn't come to these meetings. It's not personal anymore, Maria, it's professional. But I wanted to be part of his professional world, too. I had ideas. I noticed things. When he was developing what eventually became his first successful app, I suggested features that would make it more user-friendly for people like my coworkers at the factory, people who weren't comfortable with technology but needed simple solutions for complex problems. "You don't understand business, Maria," he'd say, his tone patient but dismissive. "This isn't about what people like your friends need. This is about what the market wants." Each time he said something like that, a small piece of something inside me would wither a little. But I pushed those feelings down, deep down, because I believed in us. I believed in the promises he'd made, and I believed that once his hard work paid off, once we had the life he'd described, everything would be different. The breakthrough came in our 8th year of marriage. I remember the exact moment because I was scrubbing the bathroom tile with a toothbrush. The grout had turned gray despite my constant cleaning, when Roberto burst through the front door, his face glowing with excitement I hadn't seen since our wedding day. "Maria!" he shouted, and I dropped the toothbrush into the bucket of soapy water. "Maria, we did it! They want to buy it!" He swept me into his arms right there in the hallway, spinning me around despite the mop bucket and the cleaning supplies scattered across the floor. A tech company in Silicon Valley wanted to purchase his app for more money than we'd ever dreamed of. Not millions, but enough to change everything. Within 6 months, we moved to a brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It had original hardwood floors that gleamed under actual chandeliers, windows tall enough that you had to crane your neck to see the tops, and a kitchen with counter space I'd only seen in magazines. For the first time in our marriage, I had a bedroom large enough for a proper dresser, and Roberto had an office with a door he could close. I thought the promises were finally coming true. I spent weeks decorating our new home, choosing paint colors and furniture, imagining the dinner parties we'd host, the friends we'd invite over to admire what we'd built together. I bought real wine glasses, not the plastic cups we'd been using for nearly a decade. I hung our wedding photos in gold frames throughout the house, creating a story of our journey from that cramped apartment to this beautiful new life. But something changed in Roberto after the money came. Success suited him in ways that made him unfamiliar to me. He started wearing different clothes, expensive shirts and watches I never saw him buy. He spoke differently too, using words and phrases I didn't recognize, discussing investments and opportunities with people who called him at all hours. "This is just the beginning, Maria," he told me one evening as he adjusted a tie that probably cost more than my old weekly salary. "This success opens doors. I have to be ready to walk through them." Those doors, I began to realize, only opened for him. The dinner invitations came addressed to Roberto Martinez. The business meetings happened at restaurants I'd never heard of, in neighborhoods I'd never visited. When I asked to come along, to meet the people he was working with, he'd pat my shoulder like I was a child asking to attend a grown-up conversation. "These are work things, mi amor," he'd say. "Boring technical stuff? You'd hate it." But I knew it wasn't about the technical aspects. I'd been listening to him talk about technology for years. I understood more than he gave me credit for. What I didn't understand was why the success we'd built together was becoming something that belonged only to him. The first year after the sale, I tried to find my place in our new life. I enrolled in community college classes, thinking maybe I could contribute more if I had more education. I started volunteering at a literacy center in our old neighborhood, helping immigrants learn English the way I'd once helped Roberto practice his presentations. But every time I talked about my activities, Roberto's attention would drift. He'd check his phone during my stories about the students I was tutoring, or he'd interrupt to talk about some business opportunity that had come up during his day. My world was shrinking even as his expanded, and I couldn't understand why. The loneliness crept in gradually, like water seeping through a crack in a wall. At first, I told myself it was temporary. Roberto was busy establishing himself in his new success, and once things settled down, we'd find our rhythm together. But months passed, then years, and the distance between us only grew wider. I started noticing things I'd been too hopeful to see before. The way Roberto would take phone calls in his office with the door closed. The way he'd developed passwords for everything, even the computer we'd once shared. The way he'd come home late from meetings that seemed to happen every night, smelling like expensive restaurants and someone else's perfume. When I asked about these things, his responses were always reasonable, always logical. I have to be careful with business information now, Maria. There are confidentiality issues. Or, these networking events are crucial for our future. I wish they weren't necessary, but they are. Our future. He still said our, but it felt increasingly like his future that might or might not include me. The holidays became particularly painful. That first Thanksgiving in the new house, I spent days preparing a meal for extended family, the way we'd always done in the old apartment. I bought a turkey that was probably too expensive, but I wanted everything to be perfect. I polished the new dining room table until it reflected the light from the chandelier overhead. Roberto invited his business partners without asking me first. Suddenly, our family dinner became a networking opportunity. I found myself serving people I'd never met, listening to conversations about markets and investments, watching Roberto hold court at the head of the table while I disappeared into the background like hired help. "Maria makes the best flan in Brooklyn," one of his colleagues said, complimenting the dessert I'd spent hours perfecting. Roberto laughed. "She's got hidden talents," he said, as if cooking for him every day for 9 years was some kind of secret skill. Hidden talents. As if everything I contributed to our life together was somehow invisible, something that only surfaced when it was useful for his image. After that dinner, I started paying attention to how he introduced me. In the old days, at community events or family gatherings, I was my wife, Maria, or Maria, my partner in everything. But at these new business functions, when I was included at all, I became my wife without a name, or Maria without any context for who I was or what I brought to his life. I tried talking to him about it one night, after another dinner where I'd felt like an accessory to his success story. "Roberto," I said, "I feel like I'm disappearing." He was checking his phone while I spoke, and he didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression was confused, like I'd said something that didn't make sense. "What do you mean, disappearing?" "I mean, I feel like I'm not part of your life anymore. Like I've become some kind of background person while you live this whole other existence I'm not invited into." He set down his phone then, and moved closer to me on the couch. For a moment, I thought he was going to really listen, really understand what I was trying to tell him. "Maria, you're being dramatic," he said, his voice gentle but dismissive. "You're the most important person in my life. Everything I do is for us, for our future. But I don't feel included in that future," I pressed. "I feel like you're building something I'm not allowed to be part of." His jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he was losing patience. "I work 12 hours a day to give you the life you deserve. This house, this security, this comfort. How is that not including you?" I wanted to explain that having the house wasn't the same as building it together, that receiving the results of his success wasn't the same as being part of creating it. But I could see in his face that he genuinely believed providing for me was the same as including me, and I didn't know how to bridge that gap. The arguments became more frequent after that. Small disagreements that escalated into larger fights about things we'd never fought about before. Roberto would accuse me of being ungrateful, of not appreciating the sacrifices he was making for our lifestyle. I'd try to explain that I wasn't ungrateful for his work, but that I missed being his partner instead of just his beneficiary. "You want to be involved?" he'd say during these fights. "Fine, here's the credit card. Go buy yourself something nice. Take a vacation. Enjoy yourself." Why, but that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to be involved in the decisions that shaped our life together. I wanted to understand the business that was consuming so much of his time and energy. I wanted to feel like we were still building something together instead of just living in something he'd built alone. The isolation became more acute as time passed. Old friends from our neighborhood seemed uncomfortable in our new house, and I couldn't blame them. The furniture was too expensive to sit on comfortably. The rooms too formal for the casual conversations we used to have. New friends from our Park Slope neighborhood were polite but distant, couples whose wives had careers and accomplishments I couldn't match. I tried to create a social life for myself, joining the library book club and volunteering more hours at the literacy center. But every activity felt separate from my marriage, like I was building a parallel existence because I couldn't find my place in the life I was supposed to share with Roberto. The first time I suspected something was seriously wrong was almost 3 years after we moved to Park Slope. I was organizing Roberto's desk while he was traveling to a tech conference in Austin. He'd asked me to file some papers, and while I was sorting through the documents, I found receipts for charges I didn't recognize. Dinner for 2 at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel charges for rooms I'd never stayed in, purchases from stores in Manhattan, expensive items I'd never seen at home. At first, I assumed they were business expenses, client meetings and corporate hospitality costs that came with his new level of success. But as I looked more carefully, the pattern became clear. These weren't random business expenses. They were regular, intimate charges. Weekly dinners at the same romantic restaurants, monthly hotel stays in the city, jewelry purchases from stores I'd walked past but never entered because they were too expensive for people like us. Except apparently, they weren't too expensive for Roberto anymore. My hands started shaking as I spread the receipts across his desk. 2 years' worth of evidence that while I'd been feeling lonely and excluded from his life, he'd been living a completely separate existence. An existence that included regular dinners with someone, regular hotel nights with someone, regular gifts for someone who wasn't me. I sat in his office chair, surrounded by the proof of his betrayal, and felt something break inside me that I didn't think could be repaired. Not my heart, exactly. My heart had been breaking gradually for months. This felt deeper than that. This felt like the death of the person I'd been for the past 12 years, the trusting wife who believed in promises and worked toward shared dreams. That night, I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I lay in our king-sized bed in our beautiful bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how I'd become so invisible in my own life that my husband could maintain an entire secret relationship without me noticing. The signs had been there, I realized. The new cologne, the gym membership he suddenly started using religiously, the way he'd started taking his phone into the bathroom with him, the business trips that seemed to happen more frequently, often to cities where he had no obvious business connections. I'd noticed all of these things, but I'd explained them away. He's taking better care of himself because he's successful now. He's networking more because that's what successful people do. He needs privacy for business calls because the stakes are higher now. I'd been so focused on adapting to our new life that I hadn't recognized I was adapting to betrayal. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Roberto returned from Austin on a Thursday evening, bringing me a souvenir t-shirt from the conference and talking enthusiastically about potential partnerships he'd discussed. I sat at our dining room table, the receipts organized in neat piles, and waited for him to notice. He didn't. He went through his usual routine, checking emails, pouring himself a glass of wine, asking about my day in the distracted way that meant he wasn't really listening to the answer. "Roberto," I said finally, "we need to talk." The tone of my voice must have warned him because he looked up from his phone with more attention than he'd given me in months. His eyes immediately went to the papers on the table. "What's all this?" he asked, but his voice had already changed, becoming careful and controlled. "You tell me," I said. "I was filing the papers you asked me to organize, and I found these receipts. 2 years of receipts for a life I don't recognize." He was quiet for a long time, standing across the room from me like there was a divide he couldn't cross. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Maria, you're misunderstanding what you're looking at." "Am I? Then explain it to me. Explain the weekly dinners, the hotel rooms, the jewelry purchases. Explain to me how these are business expenses when they happen every week in the same places with the same patterns." Roberto moved closer then, sitting down in the chair across from me. His expression was serious, concerned, like he was dealing with someone who was confused rather than someone who had uncovered the truth. "These are legitimate business expenses," he said firmly. "Client meetings happen at restaurants. Conferences require hotel stays. Sometimes clients have spouses who need to be considered in business relationships." His explanations were smooth, practiced, like he'd been preparing for this conversation. But they didn't address the reality of what I was seeing, the clear pattern of intimate, regular encounters that had nothing to do with expanding his professional network. "Roberto," I said quietly, "do you think I'm stupid?" The question seemed to surprise him. His carefully composed expression shifted slightly, showing something that might have been confusion or might have been guilt. "Of course not. Why would you ask that?" "Because you're explaining these receipts to me like I'm too stupid to recognize what they represent. Like I'm too stupid to understand that business dinners don't happen every Tuesday night for 2 years at the same romantic restaurant in Little Italy. Like I'm too stupid to realize that client meetings don't require hotel rooms when you live 30 minutes away." We stared at each other across the table, and I could see him calculating, trying to determine how much I actually knew and how much I was guessing. "Maria," he said finally, "I think you're letting your imagination run away with you." That phrase, "letting your imagination run away with you," was like a slap. It was the same thing he'd said when I'd asked why I wasn't invited to business dinners. The same thing he'd said when I'd suggested that his new colleagues didn't seem to acknowledge my existence. The same dismissive phrase he used whenever I noticed something that made him uncomfortable. "My imagination," I repeated. "Yes. You're creating a story based on incomplete information. You're seeing patterns that aren't there because you're feeling left out of my success. And I understand that. But you're wrong about what these receipts mean." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed him. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Maybe my loneliness was making me paranoid. Maybe successful business really did require all of these mysterious expenses I couldn't understand. But then I looked at the jewelry store receipts again. Purchases made the day before Christmas, the day before Valentine's Day, the day before my birthday. Expensive gifts that had never made it home to me. "Where are the gifts?" I asked. "What gifts?" I held up 3 receipts from Tiffany & Co. "These gifts. The jewelry you bought on December 23rd, February 13th, and the day before my birthday. Where are they?" Roberto was quiet again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had an edge to it that I'd never heard before, something cold and sharp. "Those were business gifts. Client appreciation. It's part of maintaining important relationships." "You bought a $3,000 necklace as a client appreciation gift?" "Yes." "For which client?" "I can't discuss confidential business relationships with you, Maria. You know that." But I did know, suddenly, with complete certainty. I knew there was no client. I knew there was no business relationship that required romantic jewelry purchased on romantic holidays. I knew that while I'd been trying to understand my place in his new successful life, he'd been sharing that life with someone else. The fight that followed was devastating in its politeness. Roberto never raised his voice, never admitted to anything directly, but also never provided an explanation that made sense. He maintained that I was misunderstanding everything, that my suspicions were unfounded, that my loneliness was making me paranoid. "I work hard to provide for us," he said, his tone patient but strained. "I wish you could appreciate what that means instead of creating problems where none exist." That night he slept in the guest room. "To give you space to think clearly," he said, as if my clarity was the problem. I lay alone in our king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling of our beautiful bedroom, and realized that I'd been alone in our marriage for much longer than just that night. I'd been alone while believing I was partnered, isolated while thinking I was loved, excluded while pretending I was included. The next few months were a strange kind of torture. Roberto and I maintained a surface politeness, going through the motions of marriage while both knowing something fundamental had broken between us. He became even more careful about his papers, his phone, his schedule. I became more watchful, more aware of the discrepancies between what he said and what he did. The loneliness during this period was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I was living with someone who shared my house but not my life, who provided for my physical comfort while destroying my emotional well-being. We'd sit at the same table for dinner, making conversation about weather and current events, while an enormous, unaddressed truth sat between us like a third person. I thought about leaving, but I didn't know how. Financially, I was completely dependent on Roberto. I hadn't worked outside the home in over 2 years, and my job skills from the textile factory seemed ancient and useless in our new world. The house was in his name only, purchased with money from his business sale. I had no credit history separate from his, no savings account he didn't control, no clear path toward independence. More than that, I was afraid of being wrong. What if his explanations were true? What if I was imagining betrayals that didn't exist? What if I destroyed our marriage over suspicions and paranoia instead of actual infidelity? The doubt was almost worse than the certainty would have been. It kept me trapped in a marriage that felt hollow while hoping it might still be real. The moment of absolute clarity came 6 months later, on a Tuesday evening in October. I was walking home from the library when I saw Roberto and a woman I didn't recognize sitting at an outdoor cafe in Park Slope, 3 blocks from our house. They weren't conducting business. They were holding hands across a small table, leaning toward each other in the intimate way of people who shared secrets, laughing at private jokes that excluded the rest of the world. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, partially hidden behind a tree, and watched my husband be more animated with this stranger than he'd been with me in years. He listened to her with complete attention, responded to her comments with genuine engagement, touched her hand with the kind of tenderness I barely remembered from our early marriage. She was younger than me, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of confident style that came from having money to spend on herself. Her clothes fit perfectly. Her hair was professionally styled. Her jewelry caught the light from the cafe's string of bulbs overhead. She looked like the kind of woman who belonged in Roberto's new successful world, someone who could be an asset to his professional image instead of a reminder of where he'd come from. I watched them for almost an hour, until they paid their bill and left together, walking in the direction of the hotel district in downtown Brooklyn. I knew where they were going, and I knew they'd been there before, many times, paid for with money that I'd helped him earn through years of sacrifice and support. That night, I didn't wait for Roberto to come home. I packed a small bag and checked into a motel near the literacy center where I volunteered. It was nothing like our beautiful brownstone, just a clean room with thin walls and a view of the highway. But it was the first space I'd been in for years where I could think clearly without the weight of his lies and my desperate hope distorting everything. I called my sister Carmen and told her everything. She listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or anger, until I'd finished the whole story. "Mija," she said when I was done, "you've known this for a long time. You just weren't ready to accept it." She was right. Some part of me had recognized the betrayal months earlier, maybe even years earlier. But I'd been too invested in the promises he'd made, too afraid of starting over at 43. Too convinced that I deserved whatever loneliness came with his success. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Now you decide what kind of life you want," Carmen said. "And you stop waiting for Roberto to give you permission to have it." I stayed in that motel room for 3 days, thinking about Carmen's words and trying to imagine a future that belonged to me instead of to us. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd been half of a couple for so long that I'd forgotten how to be a whole person by myself. When I finally went home, Roberto was waiting for me in the living room. He looked genuinely worried, which surprised me. Whatever else was true about our marriage, I think he still cared about me in his own limited way. "Where have you been?" he asked. "I was concerned when you didn't come home." "I saw you," I said simply. "Tuesday night at the cafe on 5th Street. With her." Roberto's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, calculation, resignation. For the first time in months, he didn't try to explain or deny or redirect. He just nodded. "Okay," he said. That was it. No apology, no justification, no attempt to minimize what he'd been doing, just acknowledgement that I finally knew what I'd suspected all along. "How long?" I asked. 2 years. 2 years. Almost from the moment we'd moved into our beautiful new life, he'd been sharing it with someone else. While I'd been trying to find my place in his success, he'd been building a completely separate relationship with a woman who fit into his world in ways I apparently never could. "Do you love her?" Roberto was quiet for a long time before answering. "It's complicated." "It's not complicated for me," I said. "Either you love her or you don't. Maria, what we have is different from what I have with her. You're my wife, your family. She's what?" She's easier. Easier. The word hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. I wasn't easy anymore. I asked difficult questions about where our marriage was going. I wanted to be included in decisions and conversations and experiences. I had needs and opinions and expectations that complicated his life. She, apparently, was just easy. Easier how? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She doesn't need anything from me, Roberto said. She has her own career, her own money, her own life. When we're together, it's just about enjoying ourselves. There's no pressure, no obligations, no complicated history. No complicated history. Like our 12 years together, the sacrifices I'd made, the dreams we'd shared, the person I'd been before he became successful enough to afford easier relationships. Like all of that was just complication he'd prefer to avoid. What do you want to happen now? I asked. Roberto looked around our beautiful living room, at the photo gallery I'd created to tell the story of our marriage, at the furniture I'd chosen to make our house feel like a home. I don't want to hurt you, he said. You've been hurting me for 2 years. What do you want to happen now? I want us both to be happy. It was such a non-answer that I almost laughed. He wanted us both to be happy, but he'd been systematically destroying my happiness while building his own with someone else. He wanted us both to be happy, but he'd never once asked what would make me happy, or whether his choices were compatible with my well-being. Roberto, I said, what would make you happy? This time, he answered immediately. I want to be with her. The simplicity of it was devastating. Not, I want to work on our marriage, or I want to find a way to include you in my new life, or even, I want to end our relationship respectfully. Just the plain truth. He wanted to be with her. Then be with her, I said. He looked surprised, like he'd expected me to fight for him, to beg him to choose me instead. Maybe a year earlier, I would have. But sitting in that motel room for 3 days, I'd realized that I didn't want to be with someone who had to choose me. I didn't want to win a competition for my own husband's attention. I didn't want to convince him that I was worth including in the life we'd supposedly built together. Just like that? He asked. Just like that. What followed was the most civilized divorce proceeding imaginable. Roberto was generous with money, guilty enough about his betrayal to ensure I'd be financially comfortable. The house would be sold, the proceeds split equally. I'd receive ongoing support until I could establish myself independently. His business assets, which had grown considerably since the original app sale, would provide me with enough security to rebuild my life however I chose. But the financial arrangements, as important as they were, felt less significant than the emotional liberation. For the first time in years, I could make decisions without considering how they would affect Roberto's image or schedule or comfort. I could choose where to live based on what I wanted, rather than what would be convenient for his business meetings. I could spend time with people I actually enjoyed, rather than people who might be useful for his career. The hardest part was telling our children. Roberto Jr. was 26, married, living in Philadelphia with his wife and their toddler. Carmen was 24, finishing graduate school in social work in Boston. They'd both grown up during Roberto's early struggling years, but they'd also benefited from his eventual success. College tuition paid in full, startup money for Roberto Jr.'s small business, a reliable safety net that let them take risks their friends couldn't afford. I called them each separately to explain what was happening, trying to be honest about the betrayal without asking them to choose sides in a conflict that was ultimately between their parents. Roberto Jr. was angry, mostly at his father. How could he do this to you, Mom? After everything you sacrificed for him. Carmen was sadder, more philosophical. I'm sorry, Mom. I know this isn't what you dreamed of for your life. Both of them offered to help however they could, and both of them expressed concern about how I'd manage on my own. Their worry was touching, but also frustrating. I'd managed plenty on my own during their father's early struggling years. I'd kept our family afloat financially and emotionally while he pursued dreams that seemed impossible. The idea that I couldn't manage an independent life now felt like an underestimation I'd been hearing from everyone, including myself, for too long. The day I moved out of the Park Slope brownstone was gray and drizzly, typical October weather that matched my complicated emotions. I wasn't sad, exactly, but I wasn't happy either. I felt hollow. like I was leaving behind a life that had never quite belonged to me anyway. I found a one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, near the community where I'd grown up. It was smaller than the house Roberto and I had shared, but it was affordable on my own and walking distance from Greek restaurants and family-owned bakeries that reminded me of the neighborhoods I'd loved before success isolated us from the rest of the world. The apartment had good light and high ceilings, and a landlord who didn't mind that I was recently divorced and still figuring out my credit situation. It came unfurnished, so I got to choose everything myself for the first time in decades. Not furniture that would impress Roberto's business associates. Not decor that would photograph well for the lifestyle he wanted to project. Just things I actually liked. I bought a small kitchen table from a family-owned furniture store in Astoria, the kind of place Roberto would have considered beneath our status during his successful years. The owner, an elderly Greek man named Stavros, spent an hour helping me choose between two similar tables, discussing the merits of each like he was helping me make a crucial life decision. "This one," he said finally, running his hand along the grain of a simple wooden table. "This one will last. Not fancy, but strong. Good for a woman starting over." He didn't know my story, but somehow he understood exactly what I needed to hear. I furnished the entire apartment slowly, carefully, buying pieces that felt right rather than impressive. A couch from a consignment shop in Long Island City that was covered in soft blue fabric I loved. Bookshelves from IKEA that I assembled myself, feeling proud of my competence with the instruction manual and the tiny screwdriver. Curtains I sewed from fabric I chose, just because the color made me happy. For the first time in years, my living space felt like mine. The loneliness when it came was different from the isolation I'd experienced in my marriage. This was the clean loneliness of solitude, rather than the dirty loneliness of being ignored by someone who was supposed to love me. I missed having someone to talk to during dinner, but I didn't miss having my conversation dismissed or interrupted. I missed sharing experiences with a partner, but I didn't miss having to justify my reactions or defend my feelings. I started going to movies by myself, something I'd never considered during my marriage. The first time felt awkward and self-conscious, but by the third or fourth solo movie date, I realized I actually preferred it. I could choose films Roberto would have found boring. I could stay through the credits if I wanted to listen to the music. I could leave early if the story wasn't holding my interest. No negotiation, no compromise, no consideration of anyone else's preferences. The independence was intoxicating. I also started volunteering more hours at the Literacy Center, working with immigrant women who were learning English while juggling jobs and families, and all the complicated challenges of building lives in a new country. Their situations were different from mine, but their determination to create better futures for themselves felt familiar. One of my students, a woman named Fatima who'd immigrated from Syria with her teenage children, reminded me constantly of my own resilience. She worked 2 part-time jobs, attended English classes 3 nights a week, and somehow managed to be present and engaged for her kids' school activities and social needs. "How do you do it?" I asked her one evening after class. "I have no choice," she said, smiling. "But also, I like who I am when I do hard things. I like the person my children see when they watch me not give up. I like who I am when I do hard things." The phrase stayed with me for days afterward. During my marriage, I'd stopped doing hard things. I'd stopped challenging myself, stopped growing, stopped becoming anyone new or interesting. I'd existed in the comfortable space of being provided for, but I'd lost the satisfaction of providing for myself. Fatima's words made me realize that I missed the person I'd been during those early struggling years with Roberto, when I'd worked multiple jobs and managed our household, and still found energy to pursue small dreams and interests. Success had made my life easier, but it had also made me smaller. I decided to go back to school. The community college where I'd taken a few classes years earlier offered a program for adults returning to education, and I qualified for financial aid based on my current income situation. I chose to study social work, inspired partly by my volunteer experiences and partly by my own recent education in how relationships can become twisted by power imbalances. The first day of classes, I was nervous in ways I hadn't expected. The other students were mostly younger, more comfortable with technology, more confident in academic settings. But there were a few other women my age, other people returning to education after major life changes, and we gravitated toward each other naturally. Study groups became social opportunities. Coffee dates with classmates became friendships. Slowly, I started building a community that had nothing to do with Roberto or his success, or the reflected identity I'd carried as his wife. Professor Martinez, who taught our family systems class, became something of a mentor. She was a woman in her 60s who'd returned to graduate school after raising 4 children and was now teaching the subjects she'd learned through both education and experience. "You have insights that younger students don't have," she told me after I'd contributed to a class discussion about how financial stress affects family dynamics. "You understand these concepts from the inside. Don't underestimate the value of that perspective." Her encouragement meant more to me than she probably realized. For years, Roberto had treated my life experience as irrelevant to any larger understanding of the world. Professor Martinez helped me recognize that my experiences, including the painful recent ones, had given me knowledge that could be useful to other people. As my first semester progressed, I started to feel like myself again. Not the person I'd been during my marriage, but the person I'd been before my marriage, updated and educated by everything that had happened since. I remembered that I was curious about people and social systems. I remembered that I was good at listening and asking questions that helped people think through complicated situations. I was becoming someone I actually liked. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in February, almost a year after I'd seen Roberto with his girlfriend at the cafe in Park Slope. Roberto and I met at the lawyer's office to sign the papers, a formal ending to what had already ended emotionally months earlier. He looked good, I had to admit. Success and happiness suited him in ways I'd forgotten during the difficult final years of our marriage. Whatever else was true about his choices, he seemed genuinely content with the life he'd chosen. "How are you doing?" he asked while we waited for the lawyer to prepare the final documents. "I'm good," I said, and realized I meant it. "I'm in school, I have a nice apartment, I'm figuring things out." "I'm glad," Roberto said, and I thought he meant that too. "I worried about how you'd manage the transition. The transition. Like our divorce was a career change instead of the end of a 12-year marriage. But I understood what he meant, and I appreciated his concern, even if it came too late to change anything between us. "I'm stronger than you thought," I said. He nodded. "Stronger than I thought, and stronger than you thought too." That was probably true. I'd spent so many years thinking of myself as Roberto's wife, as someone who needed protection and provision, that I'd forgotten I was also someone who could protect and provide for herself. When we left the lawyer's office, we stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment, not sure how to end this final official interaction. "I hope you're happy," I said. "I hope you are too." We didn't hug or shake hands or make any promises about staying in touch for the sake of the children. We just went in different directions, literally and figuratively, toward the separate lives we'd been building for months. That evening, I celebrated my official freedom with a bottle of wine and a dinner I cooked for myself in my little Astoria kitchen. It wasn't a party exactly, more like a quiet acknowledgement of endings and beginnings. I thought about calling someone, Carmen, or one of my new classmates, or one of the women from my volunteer work. But I realized I wanted to mark this transition privately, to sit with the complexity of what I was feeling without having to explain it to anyone else. Relief, sadness, fear, excitement, grief, hope. All of it mixed together like ingredients in a recipe I'd never made before, but somehow knew how to prepare. The phone rang while I was cleaning up after dinner. It was Roberto Jr. calling to check on me. "How did it go today, Mom?" "It went fine," I said. "It's official now. How are you feeling?" I considered the question seriously. Proud of myself, I think, and ready for whatever comes next. "Good for you, Mom," Roberto Jr. said, and I could hear genuine admiration in his voice. "I'm proud of you too." After we hung up, I realized that I couldn't remember the last time someone had told me they were proud of me. During my marriage, pride had been reserved for Roberto's achievements. I'd been appreciated for supporting him, for making his success possible, but not for anything I'd accomplished independently. Now my son was proud of me for rebuilding my life, for going back to school, for having the courage to start over in my mid-40s. It felt like recognition of something essential about who I was, rather than gratitude for services I'd provided. The spring semester brought new challenges and new confidence. I'd adjusted to student life, figured out how to balance coursework with volunteer commitments, and developed study habits that worked for my adult brain and schedule. One of my classes required a field placement at a social service agency, and I chose to work with a program that helped women transition out of domestic violence situations. The work was emotionally difficult but deeply meaningful. Many of the women I worked with had stories that paralleled mine in some ways. Relationships where they'd gradually become smaller and less visible. Partners who'd used financial control or emotional manipulation to maintain power. Isolation from friends and family that made independence seem impossible. The differences in our situations were significant. Roberto had never been physically violent or overtly threatening. Our financial arrangements, while unequal, had never left me in actual poverty. I'd had educational and family resources that many of these women lacked, but the emotional patterns were familiar. The way self-doubt grew over time, the way small compromises accumulated into major losses of identity, the way love could be used as justification for unacceptable treatment. Working with these women helped me understand my own experience more clearly. I hadn't been foolish or weak for staying in my marriage as long as I did. I'd been responding normally to abnormal circumstances, adapting to a relationship that had become increasingly unbalanced, while still believing it could return to the partnership it had once been. My supervisor at the agency, a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, noticed the connections I was making between my academic learning and my practical experience. "Have you considered graduate school?" she asked during one of our weekly supervision meetings. "You have a natural understanding of family systems and individual resilience. With your life experience and your academic performance, you could make a significant contribution to this field." Graduate school had never occurred to me. I was 44 years old, just getting comfortable with being an undergraduate again. The idea of pursuing a master's degree felt both exciting and overwhelming. "Is that realistic at my age?" I asked. "Age is an asset in this field," Dr. Williams said. "Younger graduates have theoretical knowledge, but they haven't lived through the kinds of challenges our clients face. You understand transformation from the inside. That's invaluable." I applied to 3 graduate programs that fall, including the social work program at Columbia University in Manhattan. The application process was intimidating. Personal statements, letters of recommendation, interviews with faculty members who seemed impossibly accomplished and educated. But I'd learned something about myself during the divorce and the first year of independent life. I was much more capable than I'd realized. I could handle complicated paperwork, navigate bureaucratic systems, advocate for myself in professional situations. I could present my ideas clearly and defend my positions confidently. The acceptance letter from Columbia arrived on a Thursday in March. I stood in my kitchen, reading it twice to make sure I understood correctly, then called Carmen immediately. "Mija," she said when I told her the news. "Graduate school at Columbia. This is incredible." "I'm terrified," I admitted. "Good," Carmen said. "Fear means you're doing something that matters." I called Roberto Jr. next, and then Professor Martinez from my undergraduate program, and then Dr. Williams from the agency. Each conversation made the acceptance feel more real, more possible, more like something I could actually do instead of something that was happening to me. That weekend, I took the subway into Manhattan and walked around the Columbia campus, trying to imagine myself as a graduate student there. The buildings were beautiful and intimidating, full of history and academic prestige that felt far removed from the community college classrooms where I'd been rebuilding my confidence. But the students I saw looked like regular people, not the intellectual giants I'd been imagining. They carried backpacks and coffee cups, talked on cell phones, looked tired and stressed and human. I could blend in with them, I realized. I could belong there. The conversation with Roberto about my graduate school plans was awkward but necessary. We'd maintained minimal contact since the divorce, mostly communications about the kids or practical matters related to our property settlement. But Columbia was expensive, and even with financial aid and loans, I'd need some additional support. "That's wonderful, Maria," he said when I told him about the acceptance. I'm really proud of you. Proud of me. The same phrase Roberto Jr. had used, but coming from Roberto, it felt more complicated. He was proud of me for achievements that had only become possible after I'd left him, successes that his behavior had delayed but not prevented. I wanted to ask about tuition support, I said. The financial aid covers most of it, but there's still a gap. Of course, Roberto said immediately. Whatever you need. Education is an investment in your future. His generosity was genuine, but it also felt like partial acknowledgement of the ways his choices had derailed my earlier opportunities for advancement. Still, I was grateful for his support, and relieved that he didn't make the financial help contingent on any complicated emotional negotiations. My first semester of graduate school was overwhelming in the best possible way. The coursework was challenging, requiring levels of critical thinking and analytical writing I hadn't used since undergraduate work decades earlier. My classmates were brilliant and passionate, the kind of people who spent their free time reading additional research articles and debating policy implications of social service programs. I loved it. The professors treated us like colleagues rather than students, expecting us to contribute our professional experiences to class discussions and research projects. My internship at the Domestic Violence Agency became valuable background knowledge rather than irrelevant personal history. In my family systems theory class, Professor Chen assigned us to write about a family we knew well, analyzing the relationship patterns and communication dynamics using the theoretical frameworks we'd been studying. Most students wrote about clients or case studies they'd encountered professionally. I wrote about my marriage to Roberto. The paper was difficult to write but illuminating to research. Reading academic literature about power imbalances, emotional manipulation, and financial control in relationships, I could identify patterns in my own experience that I'd never recognized or named before. Roberto hadn't set out to control or manipulate me. He'd genuinely worked hard to provide financial security for our family. But the way success had changed our relationship dynamics, creating increasing inequality between his expanding opportunities and my shrinking social world, had ultimately become unsustainable. The paper earned an A+, and comments from Professor Chen encouraging me to consider developing it into a longer research project. You've identified something important about how economic success can destabilize marriages, even when both partners have good intentions, she wrote. This could contribute significantly to existing literature on family systems and financial transitions. For the first time in decades, my personal experience was being recognized as intellectually valuable rather than just emotionally difficult. The transformation felt almost magical. During my second semester, I started thinking about thesis topics for the following year. I was drawn to research about women who rebuild their lives after major relationship transitions, particularly older women who return to education or career development after extended periods of financial dependence. Dr. Sarah Kim, who would eventually become my thesis advisor, encouraged me to pursue this interest. There's not enough research about resilience in middle-aged women, she said. Most studies focus on younger adults, or assume that major life changes become less possible with age. Your own experience contradicts those assumptions. My own experience as data. My struggles and successes as contributions to knowledge that could help other people in similar situations. The idea was both humbling and empowering. I started conducting informal interviews with other women in graduate school, women who'd returned to education after divorces, deaths of spouses, or major career changes. Their stories had similarities to mine, periods of feeling lost or invisible, followed by gradual recognition of their own competence, then increasing confidence as they developed new identities and skills. But each story was also unique, shaped by individual circumstances, cultural backgrounds, family situations, and personal strengths. The research was fascinating and deeply personal, academic work that felt like it mattered. 2 years into graduate school, I was interviewing for internships, preparing for thesis research, and starting to think about post-graduation career possibilities. I felt like a completely different person from the woman who'd discovered Roberto's infidelity 3 years earlier. The phone call from Roberto Jr. came on a Tuesday evening while I was studying for a statistics exam. He sounded upset when I answered, more worried than I'd heard him in years. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Dad. My first thought was health problems. Roberto was 51, not young but not old, and he'd always been relatively healthy. But stress and lifestyle changes could cause unexpected medical issues. What's wrong? I asked. His business is in trouble. Big trouble. The company he started with money from the app sale is failing, and he's lost most of his investments. The house is going into foreclosure. I was quiet, trying to process this information and understand why Roberto Jr. was telling me. Mom, are you there? I'm here, I said. I'm just surprised. When did this happen? It's been building for months, maybe over a year. He tried to hide it, but Carmen and I figured out something was wrong when he started asking us for money, asking the kids for money. Roberto, who'd been so proud of providing for our family, who'd used his financial success to justify the emotional damage he'd caused, was now in a position where he needed help from our children. Are you and Carmen okay financially? I asked. We're fine. We didn't lend him much, and what we lent we can afford to lose. But Mom, there's something else. I waited. He and Jessica broke up. She left when the money problems started getting serious. Apparently, she wasn't as committed to the relationship when it came with financial stress instead of expensive dinners. Jessica. I'd never learned her name during our marriage, but Roberto Jr. apparently knew all about her. He'd also learned that her love had been conditional on Roberto's ability to provide the easy lifestyle he'd described to me years earlier. How is your father handling all of this? I asked. Not well. He's been calling us a lot, wanting to talk about what went wrong, asking for advice about how to rebuild. He's also been asking about you. About me? He wants to know how you're doing, whether you're happy, if you might be willing to talk to him. The idea of Roberto wanting to reconnect with me after his relationship with Jessica had ended was both predictable and irritating. When he'd had better options, he'd discarded our marriage without hesitation. Now that his circumstances had changed, he was reconsidering what he'd given up. What did you tell him? I told him you were doing great, that you were in graduate school and had your own life now. I also told him that you'd probably moved beyond wanting to rehash the past. Roberto Jr.'s protective instincts toward me were touching. During the divorce, both he and Carmen had been supportive but careful not to take sides too overtly. Now he seemed more willing to acknowledge that his father had treated me unfairly. What do you think I should do? I asked. I think you should do whatever feels right to you, Mom. You don't owe him anything, but if talking to him would help you process everything that happened, it might be worth considering. After we hung up, I sat with my statistics textbook open in my lap, trying to focus on regression analysis while my mind kept drifting to Roberto's current situation. I felt sorry for him, but I also felt vindicated. The success that had seemed so permanent, so transformative, had turned out to be fragile after all. More importantly, his crisis was happening to someone else now, not to me. I wasn't financially dependent on his stability. I wasn't emotionally invested in his professional success. I wasn't responsible for supporting him through this difficult period, or helping him figure out how to rebuild. For the first time in our entire relationship, Roberto's problems were his alone. The relief I felt about that independence was profound. 3 years earlier, his business failure would have been our family crisis, something that affected my security and future as much as his. Now it was just information. Sad news about someone I used to be married to. I decided not to contact Roberto directly, but I also decided not to refuse contact if he reached out to me. I could handle a conversation with him now, I realized. I was strong enough in my own identity and secure enough in my own circumstances that his emotional needs or nostalgic regrets couldn't destabilize me. He called the following weekend on Saturday morning while I was having coffee and reading research articles for my thesis. Maria, it's Roberto. Roberto Jr. said it would be okay to call you. His voice sounded older, more uncertain than I remembered. Success had given him confidence that failure was apparently taking away. Hi, Roberto. I heard about your business troubles. I'm sorry things have been difficult. Thank you, he said. That means more than you know. We talked for almost an hour, a careful conversation that covered his financial problems, his breakup with Jessica, his regrets about the choices he'd made during and after our marriage. He didn't ask me to come back to him, but he did express genuine admiration for what I'd accomplished since our divorce. I always knew you were strong, Maria, he said. But I didn't realize how strong until I saw what you've built for yourself these past few years. I didn't realize it either, I admitted. When we hung up, I felt sad for him, but also grateful for the distance between us. His current crisis might offer opportunities for personal growth and self-reflection that his previous success had prevented, but those lessons were his to learn, not mine to teach him. I had my own growth to focus on. The following semester, I began collecting data for my thesis research on middle-aged women's experiences, returning to education after major life transitions. My methodologies professor, Dr. Martinez, helped me design interview questions that would gather meaningful information while respecting the emotional complexity of my research subjects' experiences. The women I interviewed came from diverse backgrounds, different ethnicities, economic circumstances, educational levels, and family structures, but their stories shared common themes that resonated with my own experience and validated my research hypotheses. Almost all of them described periods of feeling invisible or undervalued in their previous circumstances, whether in marriages, careers, or family roles. Many had sacrificed personal ambitions for other people's needs, gradually losing touch with their own interests and capabilities. The decision to return to school had been motivated by different factors: financial necessity, personal curiosity, desire for career change, or simply the recognition that they deserved better lives than they currently had. But regardless of motivation, the experience of academic success had been transformative for most of them. I remembered that I was intelligent, one woman told me. I'd forgotten that for so many years. Another said, "School gave me permission to be ambitious again, instead of just supportive of other people's ambitions." The interviews were emotionally intense but academically valuable. These women's experiences suggested that traditional assumptions about age and adaptability were wrong, that people could develop new identities and capabilities throughout their adult lives if given appropriate opportunities and support. My thesis advisor, Dr. Kim, was enthusiastic about the preliminary findings. "This research fills an important gap in existing literature," she told me. "You're documenting something that happens frequently, but hasn't been studied systematically." As graduation approached, I started applying for jobs in social service agencies, university counseling centers, and nonprofit organizations that served women in transition. The combination of my academic credentials, practical experience, and personal understanding of the population I wanted to serve made me a competitive candidate. The job offer that most interested me came from a program at New York University that provided support services for adult learners returning to education. It would involve counseling, advocacy, and program development work with women whose situations paralleled my own in many ways. During the interview, the program director, Dr. Angela Rodriguez, asked me about my personal motivation for the work. "I understand what it feels like to lose track of who you are," I said. "And I understand how powerful it is to rediscover that you're capable of more than you realized. If I can help other women make that journey more successfully, that feels like meaningful work." "Your personal experience is definitely an asset," Dr. Rodriguez said. "But can you maintain appropriate boundaries between your own story and the stories of the women you'd be counseling?" It was a good question, one I'd been thinking about throughout my graduate education. "My experience helps me understand and empathize with our clients," I said. "But their healing is separate from mine. I've done most of my personal work already, so I can be present for their work without needing them to validate or complete my own recovery process." I got the job. Graduation day was sunny and warm, a perfect May afternoon in Manhattan. Roberto Jr. and Carmen both came to the ceremony, along with Carmen's boyfriend and my sister Rosa, who'd driven down from Boston for the occasion. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years earlier, standing in my beautiful Park Slope kitchen while my marriage disintegrated around me. She couldn't have imagined this moment, couldn't have pictured herself as someone who belonged in academic regalia at an Ivy League university. But she'd had the courage to leave a situation that wasn't working, even when leaving meant starting over with no clear plan for what came next. Everything that followed, the apartment in Queens, the undergraduate classes, the volunteer work, the graduate program, the career opportunities, had grown from that initial act of self-respect. After the ceremony, my family took me to dinner at a restaurant in Little Italy, the same neighborhood where Roberto had taken Jessica for their weekly dinners during our marriage. But I was there with people who loved me unconditionally, celebrating achievements that belonged entirely to me. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Carmen said, raising her glass in a toast. "You've shown all of us what it looks like to rebuild your life with courage and dignity." Courage and dignity. I liked that description better than survivor or victim, terms that focused on what had been done to me rather than what I'd accomplished for myself. The job at NYU started in June, and I threw myself into the work with enthusiasm I hadn't felt about professional activities since my early days at the textile factory. My clients were women of different ages and backgrounds, but they shared the experience of feeling stuck in circumstances that no longer served them. Some were leaving marriages like I had. Others were leaving careers that had become unsatisfying or returning to education after raising children or recovering from health problems that had interrupted previous life plans. Each woman's situation was unique, but the process of rediscovering personal agency and capability was remarkably consistent across different backgrounds and circumstances. Maria was 48, recently divorced, and terrified of returning to school after 25 years away from academic work. During our first session, she cried when describing her fear that she was too old to learn new things. "I feel like I missed my chance," she said, "like I'm too far behind to catch up." "Learning ability doesn't have an expiration date," I told her. "You developed skills during your marriage and child-rearing years that younger students don't have. Life experience is an advantage in academic settings, not a disadvantage." 6 months later, Maria was earning A's in her accounting courses and had been selected for a competitive internship with a nonprofit organization. She'd also developed friendships with classmates and was dating someone she'd met in her statistics class. "I feel like myself again," she told me during one of our sessions, "but a better version of myself than I was before I got married." Jennifer was 35, recently widowed, with 3 children under 10. She'd been a stay-at-home mom throughout her marriage and felt paralyzed by the prospect of supporting her family financially while also being present for her kids' emotional needs. "How do other women do it?" she asked. "How do you work full-time and parent full-time and still have anything left for yourself?" "You don't do it all perfectly," I said. "You do it adequately and forgive yourself for the areas where you struggle. Perfect balance is a myth that keeps women feeling inadequate for normal human limitations." Jennifer eventually enrolled in a nurse practitioner program that offered flexible scheduling for working parents. The coursework was demanding, but she discovered that she loved the combination of medical science and patient care. Her children adjusted to their mother's busier schedule and seemed proud of her academic achievements. "They're learning that women can be providers and nurturers," she told me. "I'm modeling possibilities they wouldn't have seen if their father hadn't died." Every success story reinforced my faith in people's capacity for growth and change. Every woman who rebuilt her life after major disruption proved that resilience was more common than despair, that human beings were designed to adapt and thrive even under difficult circumstances. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying. I was using my education, my experience, and my personal understanding of transformation to help other people create better lives for themselves. It felt like the career I would have chosen decades earlier if I'd had the confidence to imagine myself in such a role. 2 years into the job, I was invited to present my research about middle-aged women returning to education at a national conference on adult learning. Standing in front of an audience of academics and practitioners, sharing findings that had grown from my own experience as well as systematic research, I felt the profound satisfaction of contributing knowledge that could benefit other people in similar situations. The presentation was well received, and several people approached me afterward to discuss potential collaborations or additional research opportunities. Dr. Patricia Williams, my former supervisor from the Domestic Violence Agency, was in the audience and introduced me to colleagues who were interested in developing programs specifically for women over 40. "You've become a voice for a population that doesn't get much attention," Dr. Williams told me. "Older women making major life changes are often ignored in research and programming, but your work is changing that. A voice for women like myself." The phrase felt like recognition of something essential about the work I was doing. I wasn't just helping individual clients or conducting academic research. I was advocating for a group of people whose experiences and needs had been overlooked by traditional social services and educational programming. That evening, I sat in my apartment in Astoria, looking through the photos I'd taken at the conference and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. The apartment didn't look much different from when I'd first moved in after the divorce. I'd added some furniture and artwork over the years, but I'd kept the same basic aesthetic. Simple, comfortable, chosen for my own pleasure rather than anyone else's approval. The difference was in how the space felt. What had once been a refuge now felt like a launching pad. Not a place where I was hiding from the world, but a place where I was preparing to engage with it more fully. I'd been thinking about dating, casually and without urgency. Not because I was lonely. I'd learned to be genuinely comfortable with solitude, but because I was curious about sharing my current life with someone who appreciated the person I'd become, rather than the person I'd been during my marriage to Roberto. A colleague at NYU had introduced me to her brother-in-law, David, who was a social worker at a community mental health center in Queens. We'd had coffee twice, conversations that felt natural and intellectually stimulating without any pressure for romantic development. David was 53, divorced for 8 years, with grown children and a career he found meaningful. He'd done his own work on understanding the patterns that had contributed to his marriage's failure, and he seemed genuinely interested in building something healthy, rather than just avoiding loneliness. "I like who I am now," he'd said during our second coffee date. "I wouldn't want to be in a relationship that required me to become someone different." I appreciated that perspective. I felt the same way about my own growth, and weren't interested in romantic relationships that would undermine the personal progress I'd made. We started seeing each other regularly, but without expectations about where the relationship was headed. He had season tickets to the Symphony, and I had a membership at the Museum of Modern Art. We introduced each other to activities we enjoyed separately, and discovered we had compatible tastes in music, books, and political perspectives. David had heard the basic story of my divorce and career transition, but he didn't need to rehash the details or provide therapy for old wounds. He was interested in who I was now, rather than who I'd been or what had happened to me in the past. "You seem very settled in your own life," he observed one evening after we'd been to a concert together. "It's attractive. You're not looking for someone to complete you or fix your problems." "I've been complete for a while now," I said. "I'm just interested in good company." 6 months into our relationship, David met Roberto Jr. and Carmen during a family brunch in Manhattan. I'd been nervous about introducing him to my children, not because I was embarrassed about him, but because I wanted their approval of someone who might become important in my life. Both kids liked him immediately. He asked thoughtful questions about their work and interests, shared funny stories about his own children, and treated me with obvious respect and affection throughout the meal. "He's perfect for you, Mom," Carmen said when David stepped away from the table to take a phone call. "He appreciates how accomplished you are instead of being threatened by it." Roberto Jr. agreed. "You seem more relaxed with him than I remember you being with Dad, even in the early days." Their observation surprised me. I remembered being happy with Roberto during our early marriage, but Roberto Jr. was right, that the relationship had always carried undercurrents of tension even during good periods. I'd always been working to earn Roberto's attention and approval, trying to prove I deserved the life he was promising to provide. With David, I didn't need to prove anything. He'd met me as an established professional with my own interests and accomplishments. There was no history of dependence or inequality to overcome, no promises about transformation that might or might not be fulfilled. The relationship felt steady in ways my marriage had never been, even during its most successful periods. That summer, I received a call from Roberto. It was the first time we'd spoken since his business crisis 2 years earlier, and he sounded much more like his old self, confident, energetic, full of plans for new ventures. "I wanted to thank you, Maria," he said, after we'd exchanged pleasantries about the kids and my work. "Thank me for what?" "For the way you handled our divorce. For not making it ugly or vindictive, even though you had every right to be angry. For letting the kids maintain relationships with both of us without forcing them to choose sides." I was quiet, trying to understand why he was bringing this up now. I also wanted you to know that I learned things from losing everything that I never learned from gaining it. The business failure, Jessica leaving, having to start over financially. All of that taught me things about what actually matters. What did you learn? I asked. That success doesn't mean much if you sacrifice important relationships to get it. That people who love you conditionally aren't really loving you at all. That I had something valuable with you that I didn't appreciate until it was gone. Roberto's insights were probably genuine, but they'd come too late to change anything meaningful between us. I was glad he'd developed better self-awareness, but his emotional growth didn't create any obligation for me to reconsider our relationship. I'm glad you learned those things, I said. They'll serve you well in future relationships. Are you happy, Maria? Really happy? Yes, I said without hesitation. I really am. Good, he said, and I thought he meant it. You deserve to be happy. After we hung up, I realized that Roberto's call had confirmed something important about my own recovery. His approval or disapproval no longer affected my sense of well-being. His regret about our divorce didn't create any desire for reconciliation. His current loneliness didn't generate guilt about the choices I'd made. I felt genuinely sorry for the difficulties he'd experienced, the way I might feel sorry for any acquaintance going through hard times. But his problems weren't my problems, and his insights about our marriage were interesting information rather than emotional triggers. The conversation had been pleasant, but entirely without impact on my current life or future plans. 3 years into my job at NYU, I was promoted to director of the Women's Transition Program, with responsibility for supervising other counselors and developing new services for our target population. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and the opportunity to shape programming based on my research and practical experience. One of my first initiatives was a support group for women over 40 who were returning to education, led jointly by current students and recent graduates. The peer support model proved incredibly effective, giving participants both practical advice and emotional encouragement from women who understood their challenges from personal experience. It's not just about learning study skills, one group member observed. It's about learning to see yourself as someone who belongs in academic settings. Another woman added, I spent so many years thinking of myself as not smart enough for college. These groups helped me realize that intelligence isn't age-specific. The success of the program led to invitations to consult with other universities about developing similar services. I began traveling regularly to speak at conferences, facilitate workshops, and help institutions design programs that served adult learners more effectively. The consulting work was both professionally exciting and personally validating. I was recognized as an expert in a field that had grown from my own life experience, using knowledge I'd gained through struggle and recovery to help other organizations better serve women in similar situations. During a conference in Chicago, I met Dr. Linda Chen, a researcher from the University of Illinois, who was studying long-term outcomes for women who return to education after major life transitions. She was interested in collaborating on a longitudinal study that would follow participants for several years after program completion. Your work is pioneering, Dr. Chen told me over coffee between conference sessions. You're documenting something that happens frequently but hasn't been studied systematically. We could design research that would provide evidence for the effectiveness of these interventions. The collaboration with Dr. Chen led to a grant proposal that would fund a 5-year study of women's experiences in transition programs across multiple universities. If funded, the research would provide data that could be used to advocate for increased support for adult learners and better understanding of resilience in middle age. Writing the grant proposal required me to articulate clearly why this research mattered, not just for individual women, but for society's understanding of human development and social policy. Traditional models assume that major identity development happens primarily in young adulthood, I wrote in the proposal's literature review. But increasing numbers of women are making significant life changes in their 40s, 50s, and beyond. These transitions represent untapped potential for individual growth and social contribution. The grant was funded, providing resources for the most significant research project of my career. Dr. Chen and I would be co-principal investigators, working with universities in 6 states to track participant outcomes over time. The day I received notice of the grant approval, I felt a degree of professional pride I'd never experienced before. This wasn't success measured by someone else's standards or achievements that reflected well on a partner's reputation. This was recognition of intellectual work I'd conceived, developed, and would have primary responsibility for implementing. That evening, I called David to share the news. He was genuinely thrilled, understanding immediately what the grant meant for my career and the field more broadly. "We should celebrate," he said. "This is a huge accomplishment." We went to dinner at a restaurant in Manhattan, one of the places I'd avoided during my marriage because Roberto had taken Jessica there for their secret dates. But that night, the restaurant's romantic atmosphere felt like an appropriate setting for celebrating my professional achievement with someone who valued my work. "I'm proud to be with someone who's making such important contributions," David said, raising his wine glass in a toast. "You're changing lives through your work." "I'm changing my own life, too," I said. "Every day I get to use everything I've learned about transformation and resilience. It feels like the career I was meant to have." As I sat across from David in that beautiful restaurant, I thought about the different versions of myself I'd been over the past 7 years. The broken woman discovering her husband's infidelity, the confused wife trying to save a marriage that was already over, the frightened divorcee starting over at 43, the tentative student returning to education after decades away, the confident graduate student conducting research about her own population, the professional advocate helping other women make similar transitions. Each stage had been necessary preparation for the next, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones. 6 months later, I had another unexpected phone call, this time from Jessica. She'd gotten my work number from Roberto Jr., and who had apparently maintained friendly contact with her even after her relationship with Roberto ended. "I hope you don't mind me calling," she said, her voice nervous and uncertain. "I wanted to apologize for my role in what happened to your marriage." I was surprised by the call, but not upset by it. "Thank you for calling," I said. "That's thoughtful of you." "I knew Roberto was married when we started seeing each other," Jessica continued. "I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to protect your marriage, but I knew I was contributing to hurting you. I'm sorry about that." Jessica's apology was unnecessary, but appreciated. She'd been making choices based on her own needs and circumstances, just as Roberto had been. The betrayal of our marriage vows had been his responsibility, not hers. "I appreciate your apology," I said. "But you weren't responsible for the problems in my marriage. Those existed before you and Roberto met. Still, I could have handled the situation more ethically. I was selfish." We talked for about 20 minutes, a conversation that was both awkward and healing. Jessica had her own story of recovery and growth since ending her relationship with Roberto. She'd realized that she'd been using his financial success to avoid developing her own career and identity, patterns that paralleled some of what I'd experienced during my marriage. "Leaving him was hard financially," she admitted, "but it was good for me personally. I had to figure out who I was without expensive dinners and designer clothes. It turns out I'm more interesting than I thought." After we hung up, I realized that Jessica's call had provided a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. Not because her apology changed anything about the past, but because it confirmed that everyone involved in our complicated situation had been struggling with their own issues around identity, dependence, and authentic relationship. Roberto hadn't been a villain any more than Jessica had been, and I hadn't been a victim any more than I'd been a saint. We'd all been people making flawed choices based on incomplete self-knowledge, trying to meet needs we didn't fully understand through relationships that couldn't bear the weight of our expectations. Understanding the situation in those terms didn't minimize the pain everyone had experienced, but it made the history feel less personal and more forgivable. That fall, Roberto Jr. got engaged to his long-term girlfriend, Sarah, and asked both Roberto and me to be involved in wedding planning. The prospect of being at social events with my ex-husband was initially awkward, but as the planning progressed, I realized how much both of us had changed since our divorce. Roberto was more humble and less self-centered than he'd been during his successful years. His financial crisis had taught him things about the difference between wealth and security. success, and happiness that he'd apparently needed to learn the hard way. He'd also developed a new relationship with a woman named Patricia, who was his age, professionally accomplished, and clearly not interested in being supported financially or treated as an accessory to his career. Their relationship looked more equal and mature than his marriage to me had been, or his affair with Jessica. "Patricia is good for him," Carmen observed during one of our wedding planning conversations. "She challenges him in ways that make him more thoughtful." At Roberto Jr.'s engagement party, I watched Roberto interact with Patricia and felt genuinely happy for both of them. Their relationship looked like what I'd hoped my marriage might become, but which had never been possible given the people we were at the time we were together. During the party, Roberto and I had a brief private conversation that felt like another layer of closure. "You look happy, Maria," he said. "More confident than I remember you being even during our best times together." "I am confident," I said. "I like the life I've built for myself. I can tell. And I'm glad you found someone who appreciates what an accomplished woman you've become." Roberto's recognition of my accomplishments felt like acknowledgement of something he'd never really understood during our marriage, that I was capable of achievements independent of his success, that I had potential he'd never recognized or encouraged. "Thank you," I said. "I hope things continue to go well for you and Patricia too." "They are," he said. "I'm learning how to be in a relationship without trying to control it or use it to prove anything about myself. It's healthier." That conversation confirmed something I'd suspected for months. Roberto and I had both become people who could have healthy relationships, but not with each other. Too much history, too many patterns established during years when neither of us was emotionally mature enough for true partnership. Roberto Jr.'s wedding 6 months later was beautiful and emotional. A celebration of new love that somehow also felt like celebration of family healing. Roberto and I sat at different tables but interacted comfortably throughout the event. David and Patricia met each other and seemed to get along well, making the whole gathering feel less complicated than I'd anticipated. During the toasts, Roberto Jr. thanked both his parents for showing him different models of resilience and personal growth. "My mom taught me that it's never too late to become someone new," he said, looking at me with obvious affection. "And my dad taught me that success doesn't mean much if you don't have people you love to share it with." Carmen's maid of honor speech was even more direct in acknowledging our family's journey. "Roberto Jr. and Sarah are starting their marriage with advantages our parents didn't have," she said. "They understand that healthy relationships require two people who are each complete in themselves, not two people trying to use each other to fill gaps in their own identities." Both toasts felt like recognition of how much healing our family had done, how the painful disruption of Roberto's and my divorce had ultimately led to better understanding and more authentic relationships for everyone involved. That night, dancing with David at the wedding reception, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the circuitous path that had brought me to this point. If my marriage to Roberto hadn't ended, I would never have discovered my capacity for independence, never have developed a career that used my intellectual abilities, never have become someone who could be an equal partner in a relationship like the one I had with David. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, noticing my reflective mood. "How thankful I am for everything that happened, even the painful parts," I said. "All of it was necessary to get me here." 2 years later, David and I decided to move in together, not because we needed to for financial reasons or out of fear of loneliness, but because we wanted to share our daily lives more fully. We chose an apartment in Manhattan that was convenient to both our jobs, deciding together on furniture and decor that reflected both our tastes. The process of combining households was surprisingly smooth, free of the power struggles or identity compromises that had characterized my marriage to Roberto. Both David and I had established homes and lives we loved before deciding to blend them, so we were negotiating from positions of strength rather than need. "This feels different from any relationship I've had before," David observed while we were hanging artwork in our new living room. "More collaborative. Because we're both doing it voluntarily," I said. "Neither of us needs the other person to rescue us or complete us." David and I had talked about marriage, but we seemed to be building something more meaningful than traditional marriage had been for either of us in our previous relationships. Legal commitment felt less important than the daily choice we made to prioritize each other's happiness and growth. My job continued to evolve in exciting directions. The research project with Dr. Chen was producing data that confirmed our hypotheses about resilience and adaptability in middle-aged women. Preliminary results showed that women who returned to education after major life transitions demonstrated higher levels of self-efficacy, life satisfaction, and career advancement than control groups who hadn't participated in transition programs. We're documenting something that service providers have observed anecdotally for years, Dr. Chen said during one of our research meetings. These programs don't just help individual women, they contribute to social capital and economic productivity in ways that haven't been quantified before. The research was attracting attention from policymakers interested in workforce development and aging issues. I'd been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the economic benefits of supporting adult learners, particularly women returning to education after periods of family caregiving or relationship transitions. Standing in a congressional hearing room, presenting research that had grown from my own experience of rebuilding my life after divorce, felt like the culmination of a journey I could never have imagined when I first discovered Roberto's infidelity 8 years earlier. Representative Johnson, I said in response to a question about program effectiveness, our data shows that women who participate in these transition programs contribute an average of $43,000 more annually to the economy within 3 years of graduation than women who don't have access to these services. The return on investment for educational support programs is substantial. The policy work was deeply satisfying, using academic research to advocate for resources that could help women like me make similar transformations. Every data point represented someone's life change, someone's discovery that they were capable of more than they'd realized. That evening, I called Carmen to tell her about the congressional testimony. "Mom, you were speaking to Congress," she said, her voice full of pride. "Do you realize how incredible that is?" I did realize, but not because of the prestigious setting. Congressional testimony felt incredible because it represented the complete integration of my personal experience, academic knowledge, and professional expertise. I'd become someone who could translate individual struggles into social policy recommendations, who could use scholarly research to advocate for systemic changes that would benefit other women making similar transitions. 8 years ago, I was a middle-aged, divorced woman with no career prospects, I told Carmen. Now, I'm a recognized expert in my field, presenting research to lawmakers. If that's not proof that transformation is possible, I don't know what is. 6 months later, I received a call that would change my career trajectory once again. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the dean of the Graduate School of Social Work at Columbia University, wanted to discuss a faculty position that was opening up. "We're looking for someone to develop and direct our new Institute for Women's Life Transitions," Dr. Sullivan explained during our phone conversation. "Your research, practical experience, and national reputation make you the ideal candidate. Would you be interested in discussing this opportunity? A faculty position at Columbia, where I'd earned my master's degree 7 years earlier. The chance to combine teaching, research, and program development in exactly the areas where I'd developed expertise. The opportunity to influence the next generation of social workers while continuing to advocate for women in transition." "Yes," I said immediately. "I'd be very interested in discussing this opportunity." The interview process was rigorous but exciting. I presented my research to faculty committees, outlined my vision for the institute, and discussed how academic programming could better serve adult learners from diverse backgrounds. "You understand this population from multiple perspectives," Dr. Sullivan observed during one of our conversations. "As a researcher, a practitioner, and someone who's lived through these transitions yourself, that combination is rare in academic settings." 3 weeks later, I was offered the position. Professor Maria Santos Martinez, Director of the Institute for Women's Life Transitions at Columbia University. The title felt surreal and exactly right at the same time. David was thrilled about the opportunity, even though it meant I'd be traveling more for conferences and consulting work. "This is what you were meant to do," he said when I told him about the job offer. "You're going to influence thousands of women through your teaching and research." My children were equally excited. Roberto Jr. posted about my appointment on Facebook, writing, My mom is proof that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. So proud of Dr. Maria Santos Martinez. The use of my maiden name along with Martinez felt like acknowledgement of how I'd reclaimed my complete identity, not rejecting my history, but integrating it into a more authentic version of myself. My first semester teaching at Columbia was challenging but deeply rewarding. My students were bright, passionate, and eager to learn not just theoretical frameworks, but practical applications for working with diverse populations. During a class on family systems theory, one student asked about working with older adults who were making major life changes. Traditional models assume that identity development happens primarily in young adulthood, I said, echoing language from my early grant proposals. But we're seeing increasing numbers of people making significant transitions throughout their adult lives. Think about the women you might work with who are divorcing after long marriages, or returning to education after raising children, or starting careers after periods of caregiving. Another student raised her hand. How do you help someone who thinks they're too old to change? I thought about my own initial fears about returning to school at 43, the voice in my head that had insisted I was too old to start over. You help them recognize that everything they've learned during their previous life stages gives them advantages that younger people don't have, I said. Life experience isn't a liability, it's an asset. Your job is helping them understand how to use their accumulated wisdom rather than being intimidated by their accumulated years. Teaching felt like coming full circle, using everything I'd learned through research and practice to prepare the next generation of social workers to serve people whose experiences paralleled my own. The institute I was developing would offer direct services to women in transition, while also training practitioners and conducting research about effective interventions. We'd be simultaneously helping individuals and contributing to broader knowledge about resilience and adaptation throughout the lifespan. During my second year at Columbia, I was invited to keynote the National Conference on Adult Learning, speaking to an audience of educators, researchers, and practitioners about supporting older women in educational settings. The women we serve are not deficient or disadvantaged, I said during my presentation. They are capable adults who have been underserved by systems designed around traditional assumptions about age and learning ability. Our job is not to fix them. It's to create environments where their existing strengths can flourish. After the presentation, several people approached me to discuss expanding my model to their own institutions. The approaches were gratifying, but also overwhelming. I was one person, and the need for these services seemed unlimited. That evening, I was having dinner with David when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Roberto's name, and I hesitated briefly before answering. We'd maintained cordial but minimal contact since Roberto Jr.'s wedding, exchanging pleasantries during family events, but not regularly checking in on each other's lives. "Maria, I hope this isn't a bad time," Roberto said when I answered. "It's fine. What's going on?" "I saw the news story about your keynote speech. Carmen sent me the link to the article about your work with the Institute. I was surprised he'd read about my professional activities, but pleased that Carmen was keeping him informed about my accomplishments." "Thank you," I said. "The work has been very fulfilling." "Maria, I wanted to tell you something I've never said directly. I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Not just recently, but throughout this whole journey since our divorce. You built something extraordinary from a very difficult situation." Roberto's words were genuinely moving, partly because they were unsolicited, and partly because they represented acknowledgement from someone who'd known me before my transformation began. "Thank you, Roberto. That means a lot coming from you." I also wanted to apologize, more specifically than I have before. I was selfish during our marriage, especially after I became successful. I took your support for granted and didn't appreciate what an intelligent, capable person you were. What you've accomplished since then proves how much potential I failed to recognize or encourage. His apology was thoughtful and seemed to come from genuine self-reflection rather than guilt or nostalgia. Whatever personal work Roberto had done since our divorce had apparently included honest assessment of his contributions to our marriage's failure. "I appreciate that apology," I said. "I made mistakes too, staying in a situation that had become unhealthy instead of addressing problems directly. But we both learned from the experience." "We did," Roberto agreed, "and I'm grateful that our kids got to see both of us rebuild our lives successfully. That's probably the best thing we could have given them from our divorce. After we hung up, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't realized was missing. Not because I'd needed Roberto's approval or apology, but because his acknowledgement confirmed something important about the transformation I'd undergone. I hadn't succeeded in spite of my failed marriage. I'd succeeded because of what I'd learned from it. The experience of rebuilding my identity after losing the role that had defined me for 12 years had given me insights about resilience and adaptation that had become the foundation of my career. Every woman I counseled through difficult transitions, every student I taught about human development across the lifespan, every policymaker I educated about the potential of older adult learners, all of that work was possible because I'd lived through my own transformation and could guide others through similar processes. That summer, David and I took a vacation to Italy, something I'd dreamed about for years, but never had the confidence to plan during my marriage. We spent 2 weeks exploring Rome, Florence, and the Tuscan countryside, taking cooking classes, visiting museums, and talking for hours about art, history, and the different paths our lives had taken that had led us to each other. One evening, sitting at an outdoor cafe in Florence watching the sunset over the Arno River, David raised his wine glass in a toast. "To second chances," he said. "To becoming who we were meant to be," I responded. As we touched glasses, I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been over the past decade. The frightened wife discovering betrayal, the confused woman trying to save an unsalvageable marriage, the newly divorced adult returning to school, the graduate student discovering intellectual abilities she'd forgotten she possessed, the professional advocate helping other women make similar transitions, the professor teaching future social workers about resilience and adaptation. Each stage had been necessary preparation for what came next. The pain of discovering Roberto's affair had motivated me to leave a relationship that was limiting my growth. The fear of starting over at 43 had forced me to develop capabilities I'd never used. The struggle of returning to education had given me empathy for other adult learners. The success of rebuilding my career had provided credibility for advocating on behalf of women in similar situations. None of it would have happened if my marriage had been healthy enough to preserve. Roberto and I would have stayed together, probably happily enough, but I would never have discovered what I was capable of accomplishing independently. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Roberto hadn't had an affair?" David asked, as if he'd been following my thoughts. "Sometimes," I said, "but I can't imagine being as happy in that alternative life as I am in this one." That was the truth. Unexpected, but undeniable. The betrayal that had felt like the end of everything when it happened had actually been the beginning of the most fulfilling period of my life. During our last night in Italy, David and I were walking through the streets of Rome when he stopped in front of the Trevi Fountain. "Make a wish," he said, handing me a coin. I closed my eyes and thought about what I could possibly wish for that I didn't already have. Meaningful work that used all my abilities. A relationship based on mutual respect and shared values. Children who were proud of my accomplishments. Financial security I'd earned through my own efforts. Health, friendship, intellectual challenge, creative fulfillment. I threw the coin into the fountain and wished for nothing to change, just for the wisdom to appreciate what I'd already created. 6 months later, I received news that would put that wish to the test. My publisher wanted to discuss a book contract for a general audience book about women rebuilding their lives after major transitions. Not an academic text, but a practical guide for women going through divorces, career changes, health crises, or other life disruptions who were trying to figure out what came next. "Your research is groundbreaking," my editor said during our initial conversation. "But your personal story is what will make the book compelling to general readers. You're living proof that transformation is possible at any age." Writing the book required me to revisit my own story in more detail than I'd ever attempted, examining not just what had happened, but how I'd processed each stage of my journey. The writing was emotionally challenging but ultimately healing, helping me identify patterns and strategies that might be useful for other women facing similar challenges. The book, titled Never Too Late, A Woman's Guide to Transformation After 40, was published 2 years later to positive reviews and strong sales. I spent several months touring to promote it, speaking to audiences of women who saw their own experiences reflected in my story. During a book event in San Francisco, a woman in the audience raised her hand during the Q&A session. "I'm 52, she said. Recently divorced after 25 years of marriage. Some days I feel like I wasted half my life in a relationship that ultimately failed. How do you get past feeling like you've started too late?" I looked at her across the bookstore, seeing my own fears and doubts from a decade earlier reflected in her expression. "You didn't waste 25 years, I said. "You spent 25 years learning things you needed to know for what comes next. Every skill you developed, every challenge you survived, every moment of happiness you experienced, all of that becomes part of what you bring to the next stage of your life." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and I could see her beginning to reframe her history as preparation, rather than time lost. After the event, she approached me to sign her book. "Thank you," she said. "I needed to hear that I'm not too late." "You're not too late," I assured her. "You're right on time." These conversations happened in every city I visited, women recognizing their own stories in mine and finding hope for their own transformations. Each interaction confirmed that the pain I'd experienced during my marriage's dissolution had served a larger purpose, giving me insights that could benefit other people facing similar challenges. The book tour was professionally gratifying but also personally exhausting. After 3 months of travel, I was eager to return to New York, to my teaching responsibilities, to my relationship with David, to the life I'd built carefully over the previous decade. David met me at JFK Airport when I returned from the final book tour stop in Los Angeles. Seeing him waiting for me in the arrivals area, I felt a surge of appreciation for the stability and partnership he represented. "How does it feel to be home?" he asked as we drove through Queens toward Manhattan. "Perfect," I said. "I love the work I'm doing, but this is where I belong." That evening, we had dinner at the same restaurant where we'd celebrated my research grant approval several years earlier. The familiarity was comforting after months of hotel rooms and restaurant meals in unfamiliar cities. "I have some news," David said after we'd ordered our usual dishes. "I've been offered a promotion to clinical director at the Community Mental Health Center." His news was exciting, recognition of his excellent work, and an opportunity to influence programming at a larger scale. "That's wonderful, David. You'll be excellent in that role. The position includes a significant salary increase," he continued. "Enough that we could afford a mortgage on a bigger place if we wanted to buy something together." The conversation felt like another milestone in our relationship, not because homeownership was itself important, but because it represented David's desire to make long-term plans that included me. "What kind of place are you imagining?" I asked. "I was thinking maybe Brooklyn, something with enough space for both our offices and maybe a garden where you can grow the herbs you're always wanting to cook with." 6 months later, we bought a brownstone in Park Slope, 3 blocks from the house Roberto and I had shared 20 years earlier. The coincidence was initially unsettling. I'd deliberately avoided that neighborhood since my divorce, associating it with the isolation and betrayal of my marriage's final years. But walking through the house with David, I realized that my memories of the neighborhood were separate from my feelings about the house itself. This brownstone was smaller than the one Roberto and I had owned, but it felt more like home from the moment we toured it. We spent 6 months renovating, carefully preserving original architectural details while updating the kitchen and bathrooms for contemporary living. David installed built-in bookshelves in what would become my home office, and I designed a garden that included herbs, vegetables, and flowers arranged in patterns that pleased both aesthetic and practical sensibilities. The process of creating a shared home was different from anything I'd experienced during my marriage. David and I made decisions together, consulting each other about everything from paint colors to appliance choices, neither of us trying to dominate the planning or implementation. "This feels like the house we were meant to have," David said the night we moved in, sitting on the front steps and looking at our newly planted garden. "It feels like our house," I said, emphasizing the collaborative pronoun that had been so absent from my previous homeownership experience. The housewarming party we threw 2 months later was attended by friends and colleagues from every stage of my post-divorce life. My students from Columbia, women from my support groups, colleagues from my consulting work, neighbors from our Astoria days, David's children and ex-wife, my own kids and their partners. Carmen gave a toast that captured something important about what David and I had built together. My mom and David are proof that the best relationships happen when two complete people choose to share their lives, she said, raising her glass. They don't need each other. They want each other. And that makes all the difference. Looking around the room at the community we'd created, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. Every difficult transition, every moment of doubt or fear, every small step toward independence had contributed to my ability to be present for this celebration. If someone had told me 15 years earlier, when I was discovering Roberto's affair, that betrayal would ultimately lead to the most fulfilling period of my life, I would never have believed them. But standing in my beautiful home, surrounded by people who valued me for my accomplishments as well as my relationships, I understood that everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to. The pain had been real and significant. The rebuilding had been challenging and uncertain. But the result was a life more authentic and satisfying than anything I could have imagined during my marriage. That night, after the last guests had left, David and I sat in our garden drinking wine and talking about the evening. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing my contemplative mood. "How grateful I am," I said, "for the betrayal that ended my marriage, for the fear that motivated me to go back to school, for every difficult choice that led me here. Even for Roberto's affair? Especially for Roberto's affair," I said. "Without that, I never would have discovered who I was capable of becoming." David raised his glass in a final toast. To painful lessons that lead to beautiful lives. To becoming who we were meant to be. As we sat in the garden we'd planted together, in the house we'd chosen together, surrounded by the life I'd built through my own courage and determination, I felt the deep satisfaction of promises kept. Not the promises Roberto had made and broken decades earlier, but the promises I'd made to myself about creating a life worthy of the woman I was capable of becoming. The journey from betrayal to fulfillment hadn't been linear or predictable. There had been setbacks and detours, moments of doubt and periods of loneliness, but every challenge had taught me something essential about resilience, independence, and the possibility of transformation at any age. I thought about the women I worked with at Columbia, the readers who contacted me after reading my book, the audiences who attended my conference presentations. Each of them was on her own version of the journey I'd traveled, discovering her own capacity for growth and change. My story wasn't unique. Thousands of women rebuild their lives after major disruptions every year. What was unique was having the opportunity to use my experience to help others make similar transformations, to contribute to academic understanding of resilience and adaptation, to advocate for policies that supported women in transition. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of everything had become the foundation for work that gave meaning to every day. The woman who had felt invisible and undervalued during her marriage had become someone whose voice was heard in classrooms, conference halls, and policy discussions. That transformation hadn't happened overnight or without effort. It had required courage to leave the familiar even when it was unsatisfying, persistence to continue when progress was slow, and faith that investment in personal growth would ultimately pay dividends. But the investment had paid off beyond anything I could have anticipated. At 58, I was more professionally accomplished, personally fulfilled, and emotionally secure than I had ever been at any earlier stage of my life. The promises Roberto had made about giving me a better life had ultimately been kept, not by him, but by me, for myself. I had created the security, respect, and opportunities I'd once hoped he would provide. I had become my own shelter in life's storms. As I sit here now, looking back over the past 15 years, I'm struck by how dramatically my understanding of success and happiness has evolved. During my marriage, I measured my worth by Roberto's achievements and my happiness by his attention. I believed that being provided for was the same as being valued, that financial security was equivalent to emotional safety. Now I understand that true security comes from knowing I can provide for myself, that genuine happiness grows from authentic relationships rather than dependent ones, that real success means using my abilities to contribute something meaningful to the world. The woman who once stood on that fire escape clutching a faded photograph, feeling like discarded debris from someone else's storm, became someone who helps other women navigate their own storms and discover their own strength. That transformation wasn't given to me. I earned it through years of hard work, difficult choices, and gradual recognition of capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. Every woman has those same capabilities, that same potential for growth and change, regardless of age or circumstances. The story I've shared with you isn't just about recovering from betrayal or rebuilding after divorce. It's about the possibility of transformation at any stage of life, the power of education and community to facilitate healing, and the profound satisfaction that comes from creating a life that reflects your values rather than your fears. If you're listening to this story because you recognize something of your own experience in mine, I want you to know, it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. The pain you're experiencing now, the challenges that seem insurmountable, the dreams you think you've waited too long to pursue, all of that can become the foundation for something more beautiful than you've ever imagined. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you wondered if it's too late to start over? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and someone else needs to hear it. If this message resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories of transformation and hope, reaching women who need to know that their best days might still be ahead of them. Because sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful victories, and you deserve to know that your victory is still possible.